Good evening. And I need to make a few preliminary remarks before we begin. And first of all, there will be a short period for questions and answers at the end of Mr. Welcher's talk this evening. And I would also like to invite you to a reception in the Trishman Gallery immediately outside the recital hall afterwards, where there will be further opportunities to speak with Mr. Welcher. In your programs, you will find a little card, and I invite you to fill that out. The Murphy Foundation is very interested in the effectiveness of its programs, and this is one way to let them know how effective they have been. And on a less positive note, please refrain from flash photography and make sure that any cell phones or other devices that go beep are turned off out of consideration for our speaker and other members of the audience. And now to introduce this evening's speaker, Dan Welcher. When thinking of expertise and ability, there are several traditional images. And one is the comparison of the fox and the hedgehog. This goes back to the ancient Greeks. And one common interpretation is that the fox, being a very clever animal, knows a little bit about a lot of things. The hedgehog, on the other hand, knows only one thing, but the hedgehog knows that one thing very well. But surely there must be something else, not just this either or to use a cherished Hendrix phrase, something that includes both breadth and depth. You've heard that one before. And in that regard, the image of the Renaissance man, or to be accurate and inclusive, the Renaissance person comes to mind. Someone who is adept at a wide range of activities. And that certainly describes Dan Welcher. Okay. Even within the realm of music, he is extraordinarily versatile. The world at large may know him as a composer, and you could read about his accomplishments in the program, but he is also a distinguished educator and an accomplished performer as a bassoonist, a pianist, and conductor. But his accomplishments and abilities go beyond music because he is also a writer and poet. And this evening he will talk about how he has converted the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, into an opera by writing both the text and the music. And therefore, please welcome this evening's speaker, Dan Welcher.
Well, thank you, John. And thank you to Hendrix for having me here. Can you hear me all right? I can't tell if this is working yet. Are we on? I don't usually get asked to speak as a writer. I usually get asked to speak as a composer. And you will hear my music tonight. You'll hear 21 minutes of my new opera. But mostly what I'm going to talk to you about is the process of converting a 6,000-word piece of short fiction into a 2,000 or less word libretto. And depending how much you may or may not already know about opera or musical theater, the process of writing a libretto may seem like something that is a so what answer, but it's not. I've written 2 operas before this one where I used another person to be my librettist, where I was handed the words and just wrote the music. In this case, I was dealing with an iconic piece of literature by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, as she published. Her original name was something else. And it's so famous among especially feminist writers that I was a little bit concerned that I might be offending someone by playing with this text at all. So I did a lot of research prior to starting this. If you don't, well, I'm going to tell you the story in the course of this lecture. If you don't know this book, and I did not until 4 years ago, it's probably because you're over the age of 45, because I think anyone who grew up after the 1970s probably studied this piece in English class. The woman who wrote it was very famous for 30 years and then completely forgotten. By the time of her death, very few people even knew who she was. So let me tell you a little bit about the yellow wallpaper. In fact, I have my own little control here, don't I? Yes. First, we have to talk about the woman who wrote the story. At the time she wrote the story, her name was Charlotte Perkins Stetson, and she's actually in the Beecher family on her father's side. If you knew anything about Harriet Beecher Stowe and Lyman Beecher, who was her father, this is a family of Puritans who settled in Boston actually 25 years or less after the Mayflower first descended. It's one of America's first families, and in the church world, a very important family. Lyman Beecher was one of those thundering preacher men who tried to change America and in fact made a lot of enemies as well as a lot of friends. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, is the person that Abraham Lincoln referred to as this little woman who started this big war with her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Gilmans and the Beechers were distantly related, so in a way, when Charlotte finally did marry Mr. Gilman, her second husband, she was marrying her cousin, but that's ahead of the story a little bit. As you can see from my bullet points, she was related to the Beechers through marriage. When she was a little girl, very little girl, her father left the family. And he left for a really strange reason. His wife, after giving birth to Charlotte, was told by her physician that if she had another child, she would die. The husband's answer to that declaration from the physician was to tell his wife, well, I just don't want to live with you anymore, and he left. So Charlotte never really knew her father as an infant. She was raised with just her mother, who was a troubled woman also. She met her father later in life, and they saw each other, she said, fewer than a dozen times in the course of her life, always with him being very embarrassed by the idea of having this daughter that he really wished he had not had. She married Charles Walter Stetson, who was an artist, actually at first an amateur artist, later a not very successful commercial artist, and they had a daughter named Catherine, which will figure later in the yellow wallpaper. The process of this marriage, which by all accounts was disastrous, and the having of the daughter gave her a nervous breakdown. And the nervous breakdown is what led to the story, the yellow wallpaper, as I'll get to. She was sent to a man named Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, a famous, at the time they didn't use the word psychiatrist, that didn't exist, a man who treated women's ailments, is what they called him. And he invented this rest cure, where if a woman had trouble, postpartum depression, depression of any other kind, or more physical ailments, the only cure was to lock her up somewhere without any stimulation of any kind and hope that rest would make her better. This is, in effect, what actually happened to Charlotte. She had this nervous breakdown. Her husband rented a country house, set her up in this room. He was there too, but not during the day, and would leave her there all day. She was not allowed to write, she was not allowed to read, and she was not allowed to see people. And this was a very sensitive woman who lived by writing and who lived by reading and who wanted to be herself a professional writer. So this was almost like a death sentence. In the course of the 3 months that she was locked away, she had what she would call as close to being insane feelings as you can have and still get back to the other side. So at the end of her incarceration, she was sent to Dr. Mitchell. They tried to treat her there, and she basically rebelled against all of it, left her husband, left her child with her husband, who then married her best friend, and they raised Catherine, Mr. Stetson and this best friend. Catherine wound up moving to California and then to Chicago, where she married George Gilman, and she kept his name to the end of her life. She became a very famous feminist in a time when there were no feminists. She met Susan B. Anthony. She was an early suffragette, and she campaigned vigorously her whole life on behalf of women's rights. In fact, she made more money as a lecturer than she ever made as a writer, even though she wrote, in addition to some short fiction like The Yellow Wallpaper, she wrote several books on women in economics, a book called Her Land, which is about femininity in America, a book called On Children, which was her take on the way children really should be raised in America and not the way they were being raised. But she made her living traveling on trains and speaking to audiences, mostly of other women, about how to change things in America. By the late 1920s, she had developed breast cancer, moved back to Pasadena, where she had lived for a while before, and at the very end of her life, she wrote her autobiography. And right after finishing it and correcting the proofs, she took a dose of chloroform and killed herself. She'd planned to do this all along, with her daughter by her side. Catherine was not really close to her mother, but she knew her and did spend some time with her later in Charlotte's life. This is what she looked like about the time of her marriage and when she was having her first nervous breakdown. This is the first edition of the Yellow Wallpaper. It was first published in a magazine called the Atlantic Journal and was a sensation. First of all, because it was kind of a horror story. They didn't know what to do with this piece. They told readers that this was a combination of Edgar Allan Poe and science fiction. It's neither of those things, but no one knew what to call this at the time. And then later, after it had been printed and reprinted in a couple of magazines, it was issued this way. She's still calling herself Charlotte Stetson. This is the infamous doctor himself. He was kind of a megalomaniac. He thought he was a genius and told people so. He told people that he knew more about women than women knew about women. But after the publication of the Yellow Wallpaper and the sensation that it caused, he decided to change the way that he was treating hysteria, which is a word we don't even use anymore, and said that this story and this account of what happened to this woman was enough for him to realize that the rest cure was really not a successful way to treat depression. In brief, I want to summarize what the story is for you, those of you that haven't read it. And I should say, the way I came across this, I was at the art colony Yaddo in Saratoga Springs 3 summers ago, and I told a group of writers at the breakfast table one day that I needed a vehicle for a mezzo-soprano. I needed a piece for a single singer who could hold the stage with an orchestra for over an hour and tell a story as a monologue. And someone said, "Do you know the Yellow Wallpaper?" And I did not. And they said, "Well, you should read this story." So I did read it. I asked several playwrights that I know if they would consider being my librettist, and they all didn't want to use this material. They said, "Well, I'll do it if I can do it with my own words and not use her words." And I decided, no, that's not what I want to do. I want to use as much of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's original text as I can. I'll do it myself, which is what I did. The story is this young woman who is not supposed to be Charlotte herself. She doesn't have a name in the story. She's just called by the names her husband calls her. Things like honey, sweetie, little girl, things like that. Is at the beginning of the story explaining where she is. And she's writing diary entries on paper that she has smuggled into this room in this rented house. They're there for 3 months, her husband tells her. And during the 3 months, you are to see no one, read nothing, and write nothing. But she somehow smuggles paper and pencils into her room, hides them under the mattress. The bed is nailed down, and it's on the 3rd floor of this large house. She deduces that this used to be the nursery, but there are strange things in this room. The bed is nailed down, there are bars on the windows, and she begins to wonder if in fact this was something more than just a nursery when it was in use before. The scenes that follow are her descriptions of how her mental state progresses. She keeps vacillating between thinking her husband really loves her and all of this is for the best. And in the book, her husband is a doctor and also her doctor, and that he has been reading the work of S. Weir Mitchell. He's mentioned by name in the book, and that he has decided to give her this rest cure. She believes it for about the first third of the book, but she also notices that strange things are happening to her. And one of the strangest has to do with the wallpaper in this bedroom, which to her has a strange pattern of bars in it, and she begins to see it moving. As the book progresses, she not only sees movement in the pattern of the wallpaper, she begins to see people on the other side of that pattern, specifically a woman bending down. And then later, when she's completely demented, a whole host of women out there behind the wallpaper and even outdoors, creeping towards the house. She becomes quite completely mad. And in the course of the book, she becomes disheveled. The very last scene of the story has her on her hands and knees, ripping off the wallpaper, trying to free this woman that she has concocted for herself, with a piece of rope in her hand that she's going to catch the woman with. When her husband, who has been alerted by his sister, Jenny, who is taking care of the woman, that there's really something wrong with her. He comes back from work, and she has thrown the key and hidden it under a bush in the front yard, out the window. And he's pounding on the door, and she is saying, "You can't get in, it's no use, I've hidden the key." And then he breaks the door down. In the story, the very last scene is the husband arrives, his name is John, and she looks at him and she says, "It's no use, because you see I've gotten out, and you can't put me back," and he faints. And the last line of the story is something to do now was, why would this man faint over something like that? I didn't do that with the opera, as you'll see. I ended it slightly different from that. But the idea of the woman working through her own madness, accepting the madness, and then finally just defying her husband, I thought was a very strong image for an opera. And that is the way I proceeded. One of the things you have to do in turning a piece of prose fiction into a stage work is to set the stage. And so I had to insert stage directions and devise a way of putting all of this together. In my ideal set, which I've yet to see, this piece will be done in London in August, but it's going to be a semi-staged version. You should imagine that you're looking this way at a stage that has a flat back wall and two banked walls with one big iron bed that is nailed to the floor, and on the windows, bars. These two walls have real wallpaper on them. This big wall in the back has projected wallpaper. And we have a videographer who's doing this for us, because in the middle of scene 5 of the 7 scenes, the wallpaper begins to move. As she describes what she sees, the audience sees it too. By the last scene, the whole wall is literally vibrating. Mouths are opening and closing in the pattern. Hands are reaching out of the wallpaper. As the woman is totally losing her mind, the audience is seeing what she sees. So we have a large room, as I just described it, windows on both sides, a washstand with a pitcher and a bowl, a small writing desk and a chair. She takes the paper out from under the mattress every day, sits by the window to write. And the main door in and out of the room is the audience, is this fourth wall. Costumes. I want this piece to be done in period dress. So imagine a woman who's had a baby maybe a month ago in matronly clothes at first, who in the course of her 3 months of incarceration wears less and less matronly clothes, and by the end of the final scene is really quite shabby looking. And as I say, the wallpaper is to be projected on the long back wall with the parts of the other two walls covered. A repeating design suggesting eyes, mouths, and ears within an abstract vertical design. These are the bars that she sees. And the final scene, the projected wallpaper should seem alive with the eyes and mouths opening and closing and the entire wall appearing to shake. I put the story into 7 scenes, and in Charlotte Gilman's book, the only date she mentions, other than saying that I was there for 3 months, is the 4th of July. So that turned out to be scene 3, and I decided that I would make the 4th of July the center, work my way backwards and work my way forwards and try to make it fill out 3 months. So each scene begins with the woman saying the date. None of this is in the book. And then describing where she is. Almost all the other words you hear are Charlotte Gilman's words, with a few old-fashioned words changed and some clumsy, too-wordy sentences reduced for the ease of singing, which I'll get into in a minute. But let's first talk about how the 7 scenes are laid out. The first week is the longest scene of the opera because there's a lot of expository material that has to take place. We meet her. She talks about the house. She talks about John. And there are motives. If you know opera, there are light motives that describe all of these elements. The woman has tutus. the house has a tune. John has a tune which is a military sort of a tune, always in B flat. Some of you will appreciate the humor of that. And we hear her describe where she is and what's going on in the course of about 20 minutes of this first scene. Each scene ends with an interlude, which was necessary so that the singer would have a chance to breathe, have a glass of water perhaps, and rest her voice between all of this singing. So imagine between all of these scenes 1 to 3 minutes of orchestral interlude while we set the stage. And usually there's something you can do with lights, with costume changes, lots of little things, theatrical things that show the passage of time in this way. The third week is the second scene. This, unlike the first scene, is rather nervous and fast. The music is very jerky. And I've introduced a new motive that sounds like a ticking clock for the passage of time. We also hear the wallpaper's own motive for the first time in the second scene. And I did something orchestral about the wallpaper, which you'll hear when you hear the two scenes I'm playing for you. The wallpaper is represented by the only non-orchestral instrument. It's a synthesizer. And ideally, it should sound otherworldly. The performance you're going to hear, we had to cut a few corners, and so you'll be able to tell it's a synthesizer, but it's going to sound very spooky in London this August. The second interlude starts with this clock ticking, which turns into marching feet and becomes an overlaid montage of Civil War melodies, because we're going into this 4th of July scene. The third scene is the day after the 4th of July, and she comes out waving an American flag and singing the battle cry of freedom. Rally round the flag, boys, rally once again. Shouting the battle cry of freedom, and I use that tune. Bum 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 ba ba da da dum 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 da dum. A lot in scene 4, which you'll hear. When you hear that music, you'll know why, because she has just been to a 4th of July parade. Her first outing, her first time allowed outside her prison room. And she's happy. She's very happy. She's seen her cousins, Henry and Julia. John has been nice to her. He's let her see people. And she's in this room now with her waving her flag. And in the course of the next 5 minutes, it all goes away. And she realizes that the reality is that she's still back in this prison. She lies down to take a nap, and we have the third interlude, troubled sleep and a dream, which is what you're going to hear when you hear the excerpt. That's the first thing you're going to hear is that interlude. Scene 4, a week later, is the only place in the whole opera that has what could be called an aria. And I did that for 2 reasons. One, because I needed to show sympathy for the woman and her marriage to John, because she really does believe, and I think he believes, that this is all being done for her own good. So she starts by saying, "Dear John, he loves me dearly and wants me to be well." And then in the course of the aria, a train goes by, carrying Civil War veterans to their final resting place. I love that. That's great. What a wonderful sound. But by the end of the aria, in fact, it's the last line of the aria, and it is Charlotte Gilman's line. She says, he says, I must take care of myself for his sake. And I think it's on that exact point that her mind turns, and she realizes, well, wait a minute, it's not about me, it's about him. He wants this compliant woman to mother his child, to take care of him, to be the house mother, but not to have any identity of her own. And that's when it begins to change. So she lies down again at the end of the scene, has another dream. The Dear John melody comes back, starting very sweet, but turning into another hallucination, and you'll hear that too. Scene 5, a week after that, is the first time she really confronts John. And because this is a one-character opera, she does both parts. She will say a line from John, she will say a line from herself, and this you'll hear as well, so I don't want to steal my own thunder. But it's about her telling him that she really wants to get out of this house, that she's frightened, that she's unhappy, this is not doing her any good, and that she's still losing weight. The whole point of it was for her to gain weight and feel better, and it's not working. And how he dismisses all of that because he's a doctor and he knows best. At the point when she is describing this confrontation with her husband, she describes getting up in the middle of the night, and there's a moonlight theme that I introduce here in the woodwinds. And she first sees this other woman on the other side of the wallpaper and realizes that she's really seeing another woman. And this woman actually has a couple of phrases of music, no words, just ah, that she sings. And she has her own melody, which, to those of you who are musicians, is the inversion of the melody that the woman has at the beginning of the show. It's a little waltz tune. Scene 6, 2 weeks later, begins with this sort of false pastoral music. It's gentle, it's country life, it's pretty, and we hear hunting horns, and we hear horses, and we hear the kinds of things that people would do if they lived in this house if they weren't being locked away. She begins by talking about how she realizes this other woman needs her help, and that she is going to do something about it, and her making her plans for how to fix things in her life and in this house. It ends with a repeated note, the note C, bum, 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 which is sort of a repeat of the ticking clock motive, but instead of the other tune on top of it, we hear every melody that you've heard in the opera, overlaid one after another, until it's almost unbearable to listen to. And this note, C, never goes away, breaking into the very last day. And the C turns into the reprise of Rally Round the Flag Boys. And she sings, hurrah, hurrah, this is the last day. And you realize that this is the last day, that her husband has been persuaded, or she says he has, to take her away, that they're going to get on a boat the next day, that all the possessions of the house have been packed up and taken away, and that it's time to leave. But she also says, I'm going to do something before that happens. I'm going to remove all this wallpaper, all of it, and free this woman and any of her sisters who are also behind this pattern. And I've got this rope. She's completely mental by now. I'm going to catch that woman if she gets out and tries to leave me. She never explains why, but I think it's really to show people that this exists. That's my own theory of why she wants to hold the woman with the rope. At the point where John is knocking on the door, and you hear the knocking, but of course you don't see John, she dismisses him, and then finally she stands up, faces the audience. The woman behind her, who has been vocalizing with her for the last 3 minutes, answering her phrases with the same words, but in a higher key, is visible as a shadow. They merge in the wallpaper. The lights change. We no longer see the wallpaper or the other woman. And she stands in front of the audience and sings the last lines, which are, I've got out at last, and you can't put me back, you can't put me back, you can't. Very loud, very angry, blackout, and that's the end of the opera. It's about 76, 77 minutes of music without an intermission that follows us from this woman in the first scene who's sort of happy to be in the country to this woman who has pulled off this wallpaper and is basically crawling around on her bloody hands and knees with a piece of rope. So the drama is complete. It's not a happy ending in one way, but in another way it is, because John doesn't win. I wanted you to see a little of what I changed. So here we have on the left Charlotte Perkins Gilman's original of the Dear John recit. I think I'm going to read this aloud because you'll understand why I had to change these words. I don't know why I should write this. I don't want to. I don't feel able. And I know John would think it absurd. But I must say what I feel and think in some way. It is such a relief. But the effort is getting to be greater than the relief. Half the time now I am awfully lazy and lie down ever so much. John says I mustn't lose my strength and has me take cod liver oil and lots of tonics and things, to say nothing of ale and wine and rare meat. That's a lot to sing. The lines are long. If you had to stop and breathe in the middle of it, you might lose the sense of it. This is my version. I don't know why I'm writing this. I don't want to. I don't feel able. John would think it absurd, all this writing. But I must say what I feel. I must say what I think in some way. It is such a relief. Half the time now I'm awfully lazy. John says I mustn't lose my strength. He has me take cod liver oil and lots of tonics, not to mention the red wine and rare meat. And here's the body of it. Gilman says, Dear John, he loves me very dearly and hates to have me sick. I tried to have a real earnest, reasonable talk with him the other day and tell him how I wish he would let me go and make a visit to Cousin Henry and Julia. But he said I wasn't able to go nor able to stand it after I got there, and I did not make out a very good case for myself, for I was crying before I had finished. I changed that to, Dear John, he loves me dearly and wants me to be well. I thought hates to have me sick was ugly and wants me to be well was pretty. It's things like that librettists think about, because the sound of a singing voice with loud consonants like sick versus round ones like well, they sing better, and also I wanted this to feel warmer. I wanted this whole musical section to feel warmer. Then I reduced the number of words to say, I tried to have a real talk with him the other day and tell him how I wish he would let me travel. I want to visit Cousin Henry and Julia. I want to see my dear ones. Then I'll finish Gilman's. It is getting to be a great effort for me to think straight, just this nervous weakness, I suppose. And dear John gathered me up in his arms and just carried me upstairs and laid me on the bed and sat by me and read to me till it tired my head. He said I was his darling and his comfort and all he had, and that I must take care of myself for his sake and keep well. He says no one but myself can help me out of it, that I must use my will and self-control and not let any silly fancies run away with me. I changed that to, he said I couldn't make the journey, that I wouldn't be able to stand it after I got there. I did not make a very good case for myself. I started crying before I finished. Then dear John gathered me up in his arms and just carried me back up here and laid me on this bed and sat by me and read to me. He said I was his darling and his comfort, and that I was all he had. He said I must take care of myself for his sake, and then the repetition is mine, for his sake. Because to me, that is the line that really needed to be noticed by the audience because of what follows. You're going to hear all of, oops, did we skip one? I know what it is. Can you stop that sound by any chance? Can you stop the playback or no? Except I wanted to skip one slide, and that slide's going to trigger. I'll tell you what happens. Scene 5, you're going to see when it starts. Can't stop it? Okay. The words for scene 5 I wanted to show you, but I can't without triggering this first. So let's let it go. Just let it play. You can just back it up one slide and then start that slide and it'll go. Or if you want, just start the slideshow again and I'll fast forward it to there. There we go. Okay. Did we lose the sound? Yeah, these are the other slides I wanted to show you, but you'll see them when the music is on. One more. And the next one should trigger the music. John. Just a few seconds earlier. That's good. Okay, here's a hallucination scene coming out of scene 3.
I don't want to. I don't feel able. John would think it absurd. All this writing. But I must say what I feel. I must say what I think. In some way. It is such a relief. Half the time now I am awfully lazy. John says I mustn't lose my strength. He has me take cod liver oil and lots of tonics. lucky that John keeps me here after all. I can stand it so much easier than a baby, you see. I never mention the wallpaper to them anymore. I am too wise, but I keep an eye on it all the same. There are things in that paper that nobody knows but me forever will. Behind the outer pattern, the dim shapes get clearer and clearer every day. It is always the same shape. It is like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind the pattern. I don't like it a bit. I wish John would take me away from July the 27th. It is so hard to talk to John about my case, because he is so wise and because he loves me so. But I tried last night. It was moonlight. The moon shines all around, just as the sun does. John was asleep, and I hated to wake him. So I kept still and watched the moonlight. It fell on the wallpaper, on the undulating wallpaper. The faint figure beneath the paper seemed to shake the pattern as if she wanted to get out. he said. Don't go walking about like that, you'll get cold. I thought it was a good time to talk. John, I said, I'm not really getting better here. I wish you'd take me away, dear John. Why, darling, our lease will be up in 3 weeks. I can't see how we can leave before then. The repairs are not done at home, and I cannot possibly leave town just now. If you were in any danger, I would, but you really are better, dear, whether you know it or not. I am a doctor, dear, and I know. John, I don't weigh a bit more. I can eat a little in the evening when you are here, but all day long I cannot. Bless her little heart. She shall be as sick as she pleases. But now let's go to sleep. We'll talk in the morning. John, John, so can we go? Why, how can we, dear? It is only 3 weeks more. Really, dear, you are much better. My darling, I beg of you, do not let that idea enter your head. Can you not trust me as a physician? I pretended to sleep while he slept, and I watched the wallpaper. I watched the wallpaper all night long. At night, in any kind of light, in twilight, by candlelight, lamplight, and worst of all, moonlight. The pattern becomes brass, and the woman behind the bars is as plain as can be. I didn't realize for a long time what the thing was, but now I am sure it is a woman. By daylight she is subdued, very strange sometimes. And even Jenny has an inexplicable look. I have caught John several times looking at the wallpaper, and Jenny too. I saw her with her hand on it once. She didn't know I was in the room. I asked her in a very quiet voice, with the most restrained manner possible, what she was doing with the paper. She jumped, turned around, and asked me why I should frighten her so. Then she said that the paper stained everything it touched. She had found yellow blotches on all my clothes and John's. Did that sound innocent? Did that sound innocent? I know she was studying the pattern. But I am determined that nobody shall find it out but me.
And that's the end of the excerpt that I have for you. Thank you. I have some other images to show you, and then I'll take your questions. But what you just heard is the center of the opera, from the rather calm beginning of scene 4, where she's still in love with her husband and thinks he's doing things in her best interest, to the end of that last scene where she's figured it out and that she is beginning to act on her own. This is a picture from the Camargo Institute, where I spent 4 months orchestrating the opera. It's in a lovely village called Cassis in the south of France. I got a grant to be there and lived on the Mediterranean while I was on sabbatical from UT, doing nothing but orchestrate this opera and workshopping it with Lucy, and that's Lucy and me playing the Dear John scene for an invited audience there. And these are from the session you just heard. We made a quick demo. I hired an orchestra in London for 3 hours who had not seen the music before. We rehearsed and recorded all that you just heard within that 3 hours with 2 breaks. So it's not perfect, but we had to have something we could show opera impresarios to try to sell the piece. This is the orchestra. That's me with the orchestra. Lucy was standing behind me because we found it was better for the vocal separation to have her not next to any of the players. And these were images made from her face by the videographer. Some rather disturbing ones. I'm only going to show you a couple. This was one made by an artist who was at that first hearing of the scene, who doodled on the first page of my score. I had given them each the first page of the score, and she imagined what she thought the yellow wallpaper would look like by turning my score sideways and painting on it in watercolor. So you can see some mouths and some hands. Rather spooky. And that's it. So you can turn that off if you like, and maybe bring the house lights up, and if people want to ask me some questions about anything at all, really, about this opera, about making librettos, about being a composer, since you don't usually have those on this series, and I'd be happy to take any questions that any of you might have.
Did you find that your interpretation of the short story changed as you converted it into an opera?
That's a really good question. Yes, because just reading it once, you have a certain idea of what is really going on psychologically. Distilling it down to singable lines and then writing those lines one at a time. And composing is a very slow process. To write 40 bars in a day is a lot. And this piece has over 4,000 measures, so you can imagine how long that took. I had really, the biggest thing I had to do from the story to the opera was set moods that were not the same mood all the way through. Because when you read this piece, you read this woman's dishevelment that goes back and forth almost on every page. And I couldn't let the opera do that, because that would drive the audience nuts and people would just be looking at their watches. So I would, over each scene as I'd started, write words to myself like calm or ticking, and stay with that mood, even though the words might backtrack a little bit. Keep the mood the same for a while so that people could stay in that musically long enough to identify with it. I think that was probably the biggest problem. And saving the best for last, which of course you haven't heard, when she's really wailing, and also saving it so that the singer would not be out of voice by the time she got there. Good question. Karen. Ha. The question was I influenced by Lulu, which is Alban Berg's unfinished second opera after Wozzeck? No, not really. I like it, but that's very much about a different kind of woman and a lot of characters and a big orchestra. This had to be smaller and more intimate. I'd say I was more interested by Erwartung and maybe by La Voix Humaine, that is also a monodrama about a woman talking on a phone while her lover is saying goodbye to her and nothing else happens. Things that maintain a simple set and don't jump around with circus animals and things like Lulu does. Yes. Yes. Right. I did want to put Jack the Ripper into my opera, but I just couldn't find a way to do it. Other than just the hidden woman, you mean? No, I gave up on putting John on the stage early on. First of all, Charlotte doesn't really do that. He doesn't ever talk. Even the scene that you just saw, the confrontation scene, was Charlotte remembering it in her diary. And I had to have her be everybody, because the whole book is about her viewpoint. And I thought to diminish that at all would be to weaken the story. Made it harder to write it, because one voice type and a chamber orchestra over that span of time is a lot to listen to. And that is the challenge. But I had to see if it would work. And I won't really know till I hear the whole thing straight through.
Did you complete the whole libretto before you started writing the music?
Yes.
And then once you started the music, did you make any changes along the way?
Yes. The libretto, as it was being set, was being tweaked. A word that didn't come out right. A number of syllables in a line that needed one more or one less. Little tiny things like that. But dealing with an existing text is hard, because I didn't want to really change her words. You saw what I did change, and it was small. Mostly about leaving things out to make it flow better. But I didn't want to presume that I could rewrite the story, so no, I didn't do that. When the piece was completely finished, I cut about 9 minutes, mostly from the first scene. There's a long episode about her seeing a lake on the property and a rowboat and wishing she could get in, and I'd made this lovely water music and everything. Slowed it down too much, so that all left. There's about 9 minutes of music on the cutting room floor that I probably won't be able to reuse for anything else either, because it's full of these motives. But that was the process. Well, I've kept you here an hour and 5 minutes. That's, I guess, what I'm supposed to do, yes? So unless there's another question, thanks for your attention. It's been lovely to be here.